when conflict happens, there's a bit of a misnomer or misconception about how conflict works in organizations. So the traditional idea is that, well, conflict is between two people and they sort of have it out and that's the end of it. But that's not how it works. Conflict plays itself into group dynamics. And so now it's not just a person A and person B in conflict, but it's person A and all of person A's friends versus person B and all of person B's friends. And then the issues also proliferate. And that's what builds this culture of conflict.
That's Blaine Donais, founder of the Workplace Fairness Institute, talking about conflict in the workplace. Blaine is a labor lawyer and member of the Law Society of Upper Canada since 1995, and is an expert in both the practice and theory of assisted labor management negotiation, mediation, arbitration, and facilitation. He has the Chartered Mediator designation from the ADR Institute of Canada and is a registered practitioner of dispute resolution through the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation. Blaine trains human resource professionals, labor leaders, and others in human rights, labor and employment law, human resources, collective bargaining, and conflict resolution. He's presently Adjunct Professor of Workplace Dispute Resolution at Atkinson College, York University, Toronto, and Adjunct Professor for the Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources at the University of Toronto. I'm your host, Warren Hoffman, and in this episode we dive into conflict in the workplace. Blaine unpacks workplace conflict and walks us through his restoration process to transform toxic workplace cultures. We speak about symptoms and causes of toxic work environments, the cost of unresolved conflict, the major reason professionals leave their positions, what conflict in the workplace looks like, the process and challenges of workplace restoration, how conflict training is a core competency of leadership, how trust is at the core of workplace restoration processes, the use of coaching as a tool within workplace restoration, what managers and business owners can do to assess and prevent conflict in the workplace, what employees can do if they find themselves in toxic work environments, and much, much more.
This is Conflict, Power, and Persuasion, podcast of the Canadian International Institute of Applied Negotiation.
Hi, Blaine. Thanks for doing this.
Hi.
In the intro, I provided a short blurb on your background. Can you talk a bit about yourself, your professional experience, and how you got into this field?
Okay. I mean, so my professional background started off as a labor lawyer, a union side labor lawyer, and I worked in that capacity for many years, doing in-house work for a large professional union. But in terms of the workplace fairness type work, that was a passion that grew from increased involvement in mediation and alternative dispute resolution with a focus on work and the proposition at work that existed when I first started practicing, which is that more or less workplaces have a system. There's a state system within workplaces in Canada that's very much an autocratic state system. And that, really raised questions for me in terms of comparison of our lives as citizens in our country and our lives as workers in organizations, and how there's a kind of a disconnect between those two. And so my passion has been very much to help organizations see the value proposition in treating workplace participants in the same way that we treat ourselves as citizens in our society.
So you went on and you founded the Workplace Fairness Institute. Can you tell me more about the Institute and the type of work that you do there?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I founded the Workplace Fairness Institute in 2005. It was primarily founded for the purpose of advocating for the very concept that I was talking about, fairness in the workplace, and defining what fairness meant, equity of concern and respect for each individual in the workplace, regardless of their position in the workplace, and looking at structures, workplace structures, and how they operationalize that principle. And so, to begin with, the Workplace Fairness Institute was very much an advocacy organization, research advocacy. We had produced a journal, Workplace Fairness Journal, where we helped kind of broaden the thinking about organizational justice and fairness, and how that works in Canadian workplaces and workplaces around the world. And it evolved from that into a pretty substantial practice in terms of providing workplace restoration services, workplace training services, workplace investigation and mediation, and consulting. And the latest thing that we are into is providing a consulting service for federally regulated employers on how to implement Bill C-65. We also in the course of all that, we developed an affinity and friendship with Dr. Martin Shane, who is considered to be sort of the grandfather of the psychological health and safety standard. And we've worked quite closely with him in terms of thinking about the relationship between workplace fairness and psychological health and safety. So, and so that's sort of where we're at this point. We have a partner organization that we work with called Workplace Fairness West, run by Michelle Fineuf, and that organization partners with us on various things, and we've also developed other strategic partnerships as well.
Mm-hmm. That link between fairness and health is an important one, I imagine. Can I just get the definition you had of fairness? You mentioned earlier, sure, just to highlight, it was equity and respect, regardless of position. Was that it?
Yeah. So it's equity of concern and respect for each individual in the workplace, regardless of their position in the workplace.
Wonderful.
And this is a concept that is comes from John Rawls, Ronald Dworkin, trying to define justice as fairness, and we've applied that to a workplace context.
I want to dig more into the restoration piece. Could you give a quick synopsis of what workplace restoration is, and then we'll dig a little deeper into the process of that, if we could.
Sure. So, in Canadian workplaces, I guess workplaces around the world, there are often work groups that suffer challenges. Sometimes historical challenges in the way that people work with each other, sometimes challenges related to different management styles and how they impact on people. And these challenges can cause stress and in some cases even trauma for workplace participants. And so workplace restoration process is one that is designed to help basically with the healing of people who have gone through what they've gone through in the particular work group. But it's more complicated than that, in the sense that there's a diagnostic component to it, and of course an opportunity to actually improve the workplace behavior, structures, and ideas.
Mm-hmm. So, to make this more clear, when a client approaches you, what are the symptoms that they're typically experiencing in the workplace? So what type of situations are they encountering that led them to seek help?
Yeah, there's a variety of sources of trauma. Often they relate to some decisions or a change or introduction of a new leader into the organization or new leaders, and kind of a clash of perhaps values or strategies or approaches. Sometimes this is the result of long-standing, ongoing conflict in the workplace between staff. And in some cases, I've actually been involved in workplace restorations where I've interviewed someone and I asked the person, well, what's going on here? And the person starts talking about things that happened 25 years ago.
Right.
And so, there's this kind of culture of conflict that has been created. And so part of the role of workplace restoration is actually culture change.
Right. So it's the existing culture, and then there's some sort of triggering event that brings it to the attention of the management and whatnot.
Yeah, I guess I'd say about that there might be a triggering event that's causing a sufficient enough amount of pain that propels the employer to invest the resources in change. Mm-hmm. So so where the employer is not necessarily feeling a lot of pain, a situation like this may go on for a very long period of time. Mm-hmm. It's usually at the point where they're going to call an external practitioner in. It's usually at the point that things are pretty bad.
Right.
All right. Right.
Is there any early warning indicators or whatnot that would managers could be aware of that they're in sort of a conflict culture and that there's sort of a workplace conflict canary, if you will, so that they're better adapted to deal with those events and change and whatnot?
Yeah, there are a few symptoms, and easily observable symptoms. One of the, and in some cases it's even as simple as walking into the workplace setting and the kind of the chill in the room. Mm. This is the result of a history of conflict. One party manifests conflict sometimes, but conflict that has led to a destruction or erosion in trust in the workplace's systems to have productive conversations about whatever the issues are. And so then what happens is that people don't talk about the issues. They, instead it comes out in more sort of passive aggressive type behaviors. And so in some workplaces, the warning signs can be much more blatant. And this is typically in workplaces where employees feel safer for some reason, feel safer raising issues. And so let's say in a unionized workplace, things will get to a point where all of a sudden grievances start to be filed. But in my view, if the employer is waiting for grievances to be filed to do something about it, the employer has sort of wasted a lot of opportunity to get these issues dealt with early on before they become big, huge problems.
Yeah, that's one way to put it there. You use the expression a chill in the room. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can imagine trying to work in that environment, the productivity, just the lack of communication. I think a lot of managers and business owners aren't really aware of the costs of conflict. Can you talk a bit about literally the cost of conflict? Like, what's at stake here?
Yeah, and you know, this is something that we've done quite a bit of research on. There's a number of different categories of cost, and by conflict, what we're talking about is negative conflict, and how we define conflict is as perceived injurious events where there's naming, blaming, and claiming, or at least naming and blaming, and therefore, you know, there's negative attributions that arise from that, and so on. So what happens in terms of costs? So there's, first of all, there's costs associated with the individuals directly involved in the conflict. Mm-hmm. And with regard to them, there are mental health costs. That conflict can be extremely stressful and cause, you know, all kinds of mental health challenges. And, you know, in countries like Canada, there's a financial cost to the employer in having employees who are suffering in that way. And that's just kind of the tip of the iceberg. Mm-hmm. That's the very obvious thing. What happens with where there's a culture of conflict is that there's trust in the organization is eroded. There's a lot of exit from employees who have options. And just to give you a good example of this, in 2007, the Level Playing Field Institute in the United States did a survey of professionals, 14,000 professionals in the United States. And what they found was that the vast majority of the reasons, for the vast majority of professionals, the reason why they leave their position was a sense of unfairness. And there's a direct relationship between conflict and unfairness, because perception of unfairness. Because what happens when there is conflict is that there's an expectation that the organization will have structures in place to help manage conflict as it arises, and will ensure that people are feel like they are treated fairly throughout whatever those processes are. And where that doesn't happen, people with options often tend to leave. And actually, that with that survey, they estimated, this is 2007, but they estimated that upwards of 2 million professionals a year in the United States leave their position. Wow. Because of fairness.
Yeah, that's incredible.
You know, and we're still just talking about the tip of the iceberg. What happens when people are in conflict is that they become less productive. They spend more time in conflict with each other. Their engagement level is lower. The discretionary time, effort, and energy they have, instead of being devoted to the success of the organization, is being devoted to this conflict. Yeah. And the costs for managing people in conflict are quite high. It's been estimated that the average manager spends 55% of their time managing conflict. And so, you know, you think about that from an organizational perspective, yeah. That's an incredible amount of money being spent on conflict. HR professionals, labor relations professionals, ombuds functions, you know, occupational health and safety professionals, the list goes on of people who, you know, who are spending their time helping to manage conflict in an organization. And still, we've just hit the tip of the iceberg, because when you account for the amount of actual time that's being spent on conflict for those in conflict, and you know, you multiply that by the number of employees in a group, that starts really racking up. But by the way, I did want to mention that when conflict happens, there's a bit of a misnomer or misconception about how conflict works in organizations. So the traditional idea is that, well, conflict is between two people and they sort of have it out and that's the end of it. But that's not how it works. Conflict plays itself into group dynamics. And so now it's not just a person A and person B in conflict, but it's person A and all of person A's friends versus person B and all of person B's friends. And then the issues also proliferate. And that's what builds this culture of conflict.
There's power in building your alliances and whatnot, and power in weakening the others through gossip and
exactly
nasty situation. That stat of 55% of time is just, that's incredible. Yeah, so early warning, dealing with this, getting a healthy organization is certainly what you want to aim for. But let's say that was missed and you're called in. Let's get into the process here.
Sure.
What are the very first steps then that you would take, and sort of the typical trajectory of the process then? What's a typical process look like?
Yeah, so the model that we have developed on this, after working many years doing workplace restoration work, has 5 phases to it. The first phase is called organizing. The second phase is assessment. The third phase is reporting and recommendations. The fourth phase is engagement, and the fifth phase is monitoring. And this is a process that is actually intended to affect culture change in the organization. So just like any other culture change exercise, it's a process as opposed to a project.
Right.
And so let's begin with the organizing phase. One of the things that's fairly unique about our approach to workplace restoration is we want to try and build internal capacity within the leadership of the organization for them to carry on this process. And this is critically important. Build trust in the leadership and provide the leadership with the tools that they need to carry this process on. Now, we're still there. We're a part of what's going on, and we play some key roles in certain phases here. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to build a team around the restoration. We call it a workplace restoration team. And this team, would consist of workplace leaders. And workplace leaders would be, primarily the line management leaders. There might be some HR function there. If it's a unionized workplace, there might be union leaders. And whether or not it's a unionized workplace, there might also be, and there usually is, representatives from the work group where that is the subject of this restoration. And so what we look for there is sort of informal leaders in that workplace. And this team is going to be the focal point for the restoration process moving forward. And so all the communications come from the team. Advocacy for the process, feedback about how the process is going, it all gets filtered into the team. And our role is a role of facilitator for that part of the process. And this is a lesson that not only that we learn by practice, but it's also well established in theory. Costantino and Merchant's Designing Conflict Management Systems is a good example of that, where we are not the person coming in to fix the problem. We are the group that is coming in to empower the workplace leaders to fix the problem. So
reminds me of locally led peace initiatives where you go in and you help, the locals do it. It's the same concept. So then you get that sustainable, lasting change. Yeah.
Exactly. No, that's exactly right. And because if what we're looking at is culture change,
yeah.
Well, we're not going to be a part of that culture
right.
2 years down the road,
right?
And so we want them to take the leadership role and empower them to do it. So and by the way, one of the challenges that many workplaces have is that there isn't a strongly held view that leaders are conflict managers. And there's a management philosophy about this that we typically find in organizations where there are challenges. And that is in organizations where leadership sees their role as to produce more, to have better bottom line, better outcomes, and so on. And they don't really see that it's their, like line management doesn't see that it's their role to sort of take care of people.
Right.
That's HR's job. But in the modern world, which has been made exquisitely clear by the Psychological Health and Safety Standard, this is a core competency of leadership now.
Right.
Is emotional intelligence, basic conflict management skills, communication skills, so on. And so this is part of what we're doing. Is we're helping to train the leadership to be good conflict managers.
Yeah. You're doing that very early on. This is the first stage. You're doing capacity building of the leadership.
Yeah.
Okay, let's keep moving then. So that's
sure.
the organizing stage. We're just getting started here.
That's right. So the organizing and I'm spending a lot of time in the organizing phase because, in my view, it's the most important.
Right.
Because if you don't set yourself up for success, you're going to fail. And so this is a trust building exercise. So when there's a conflict in a work group, that conflict has produced an erosion of trust. And what we're trying to do is rebuild trust in people, processes, and circumstances. So the first major step in rebuilding trust is to build a team of individuals with different interests that can come together and build trust in each other. It's emulating what the whole process is going to look like.
Right.
So we've got this team, and the next phase is going to be the quote unquote assessment phase. And typically speaking, mechanically, we want to have a conversation with each and every person in that subject workplace, like the subject work group, whether or not they've been identified as in conflict, because we know that everybody is affected by the conflict. Number one, everybody is affected by the conflict. And number two, everyone has a role to play in establishing the course moving forward. Mm-hmm. And so we want to, so in the assessment phase, we're not just going to be asking about the past and, and what's happened and the present state, what's going on now, but we also want each individual to contribute to the future. So we're going to be getting their advice on, how do we move forward? How do we make things work, and so on. And, the assessment phase can have a few other things, like depending on the size of the workplace. So one of the other differences between our model and some other models is that some of the other models aren't very effective once you get beyond about 15 people. Part of the reason for that is that they've placed more or less all the responsibility on the practitioner to affect the restoration. So by the introduction of the team in the organizing phase,
right,
we've taken a big step there.
Right.
But we can also, we've found we can have an effective restoration in workplaces with dozens and dozens and even hundreds of people. The assessment strategy needs to be different for larger organizations. We may need surveys. We may need to have some focus groups and so on. But again, that's entirely dependent on the resources that the organization wants to put into this. I'd say ultimately the best assessment phase involves an individual conversation between the facilitator and each and every person involved. And then what comes out of that in the reporting and recommendations phase is a list of themes, issues, and recommendations.
Right.
And so this is not an investigation. So there's no rules of evidence. There's no 300-page reports with detailed, meticulous findings of fact and so on and so forth. The reporting is meant to be a sense of acknowledging what people are saying about and feeling about this workplace, a list of the recommendations that have been generated from the participants in confidence, and then further recommendations from the facilitator. And there's a reason for the further recommendations, and there's a couple of different approaches related to that. One theoretical viewpoint would say that the facilitator should not make any recommendations except recommendations about the process. So in other words, the facilitator might recommend, well, there may need to be one-on-one coaching sessions with individuals. There may need to be some interpersonal mediation. There may need to be group facilitation.
Right.
So that's one approach. And another approach is that the facilitator is adding to the recommendations that have been made by the participants with best practices type recommendations. And either, these both approaches have their pluses and minuses. The important thing is to make it clear with the client which approach is going to be used. But typically speaking, the first approach is the one that, in a sense, vests the most authority into the participants themselves. The second approach may sort of detract somewhat from that, but what it adds is best practices from other workplaces, which can also be really helpful. So then we get into the engagement phase, and the engagement phase really implements the recommendations that have been put into reporting.
Right.
Timelines, schedules, deliverables. The workplace restoration team is still engaged here. They are still involved in reviewing the recommendations, maybe even providing feedback and so on and so forth, and may also be involved in at least the advocacy part of the engagement phase, where they're encouraging people to take advantage of what's being offered.
I was going to ask about that. The second point there was that you were sort of in the reporting stage. You were acknowledging what was happening there, and I mean that's a pretty important conflict de-escalation technique, is just to acknowledge the other, what they're feeling and whatnot. Now that acknowledgement's coming from you, though. Is there ever the management or perhaps the team, the restoration team, that's sort of acknowledging the issues within the organization? Yeah, okay.
And there's a stream of dialogue throughout the whole process where this happens. It begins right at the start when we make the efforts to construct the restoration team. So we're going to the leadership is going to reach out to the other stakeholders, acknowledging that this workplace has a challenge, and that and we strongly encourage the leadership to take responsibility for their role in the challenge. And then to set the assessment phase up for success, the restoration team is going to acknowledge that there's a reason why we're going through this process, that there are challenges, there's opportunities, and that they're going to be as transparent as possible, and they want to engage people in the thinking about that. And then getting into the reporting part after the assessment, the reporting party is going to lay this out in a great deal of detail. But what are the challenges from the perspective of each person here, right? And, what are some of the reasons for that and the responsibilities and so on. But it's done in a structured way that is meant to protect the psychological safety of the participants in the process. So we wouldn't say employee X said this.
Right.
What we would say is, this is one of the issues that has been raised. But also, just as important is this list of recommendations that the employees or the workplace participants come up with themselves. And the reason why I'm saying workplace participants instead of just employees is that I want to make it clear that line managers, supervisors, HR professionals involved in this workplace, and basically everybody who lives in this workplace has a right to a voice in the process. So this is not just the staff telling the leaders what crappy leaders they are. It's also the leaders talking, about themselves and about the challenges and so on and so forth, right? Mm-hmm. So it's meant to, as is typical with culture change, it's meant to be a process that helps to reform a consensus, a social compact, as it were, for moving forward. Something that everybody has a common understanding of. And often with a restoration process, this involves quite a bit of discussion about roles and responsibilities.
Right.
Whose job is it to do what?
Right. Now, can you give me an idea in the engagement phase? I mean, you're going to have, he mentioned, some are going to need coaching. There could be mediations needed. I mean, what sort, I guess this is going to depend on the size of the organization, but this could be a pretty huge and quite involved process. Like, what time period are we talking here? What sort of issues might you be coaching on? Like, how many mediations might be involved? Mm-hmm. Just give me an idea of
it's a good question.
Yeah.
I'm gonna give you my old lawyer's answer. It depends, right? But right. But really, interestingly enough, each time we go through this process, the thought is that, oh my God, the engagement piece is going to take forever because there's all this big mess and so on and so forth. But here's how conflict works. Because there's such a direct relationship between conflict and trust, what appears to be an insurmountable task at the beginning of the process starts to change dramatically as you start moving through the process. If you were to guess at the beginning of a process, let's say with 30 people, where there's been sort of conflict rife through that part of the organization for many years, you might think, oh my God, we're going to have to, it's going to be mediation after mediation and intervention and coaching and so on and so forth. But one of the big reasons for that is that people aren't talking with each other. They're not communicating with each other. Why aren't they communicating with each other? Because they don't trust each other. And so a workplace restoration, like a mediation, acknowledges that the main driver of conflict now is a lack of trust. And so what a process does, like workplace restoration or mediation, is that it compensates for a lack of trust in people with enhanced trust in a process.
Yes.
And so the more momentum that is built around this process, the fewer negative attributions arise in others. And so it sort of normalizes relationships. It starts normalizing relationships right off the bat. It starts taking the heavy anvil that's hanging over people's heads. So some of that is managed through this process. And you can see in the workplace setting an almost visible sigh of relief that, okay, there's something here that we can do, that we're doing. And so much of conflict is related to fear, that people in conflict end up being in fear of each other, in a sense, in fear of themselves and their own conversations, coming back to difficult conversations, their identity conversations, their feelings conversations. So in the assessment phase, what we often find in the assessment phase, if we're really successful with this, is that by the time we get to the assessment phase, way over half of our job is already done, because people have had an opportunity to unload,
get them talking.
Get them talking. They also have had an opportunity to provide meaningful recommendations and input. And guess what's happening when this assessment phase is going on? People are starting to talk to each other in the workplace itself.
Right.
And so the dynamic is already starting to change. Now, something like coaching. Coaching is something that we do. We do it fairly extensively. And I'll say here, I'll confess that the vast majority of coaching is actually not conflict management coaching. It's leadership coaching.
Leadership, right.
And it is directed at the leaders. It's directed at how to be a good leader in this context. And I have to say that the vast majority of workplace restorations that we step into involves something to do with one or more leaders.
Yeah. Management styles. Does their conflict management styles, is that one of the big focuses there?
Conflict management styles is a big piece of it. Emotional intelligence, right. Even such things as understanding, the leaders understanding what's going on within themselves.
Right.
So one of the typical things we do is we'll provide difficult conversations type coaching for some leaders, but it's not just leaders. There are staff and what some might have called maybe 20 years ago difficult personalities, or that sort of thing. And part of the coaching is not just how to sort of make yourself better, but how to respond to someone that you do consider difficult, right? And so by building this capacity, that makes some difference. Interpersonal mediation is used. It's in my experience, it's only used in combination with fairly extensive coaching. And the reason why I'm saying that is there's kind of two drivers for this. The first one is that the need for mediation, the need for an air clearing exercise facilitated by a third party, has to do with trust between the two individuals involved. And again, we're back to trust in the process.
Right.
And so if the coaching is very successful, then you may not need mediation, because the individuals involved will have the skills and again self-awareness to be able to manage this themselves. And it's only in the more extreme ends where a third-party facilitated interpersonal mediation might be successful, but to make that successful, you have to prepare the parties quite extensively. And then the kind of the main piece is the group facilitation, which in my view is pretty important, vitally important to the process of moving on. The exercise of getting people in the room or virtual room now together to agree upon a consensus. And I just wanted to mention about that we've covered 4 of the 5 phases.
Yeah.
And the monitoring phase is something that many employers will skip. And in my experience, they skip it to their great disadvantage. But the reason why they skip it is sort of like this. If you have a pain in your side and you go to the doctor and the doctor says to you, okay, here, take these pills and come back in 3 weeks, and we'll look at you again. There's a huge proportion of people who, once the pain is gone, won't go back to the doctor again.
Right.
And the same principle applies here, that once the employer kind of stops feeling the pain, the employer is going to say, oh, well, everything's fine now. But what we're talking about is culture change. And there is significant recidivism in culture if it's not reinforced.
Mm-hmm.
And so monitoring is an opportunity to positively reinforce this new culture.
Right.
Celebrate the successes, diagnose the areas where more work needs to be done, and and continue on. In my experience, for those employers who have agreed to monitoring and taken it seriously, it's more about celebrating the successes because they have embraced the concept that this is really about culture change, and it needs to be constantly reinforced. So when we come back to assess again, which is part of the monitoring process, we'll come back and we'll have some sort of assessment. It might not be as rigorous as the first one. Like, it might simply be, we could do a survey, or we could just talk with the restoration team itself. Or we might have a 10-minute get together with each of the staff, that sort of thing. But typically speaking, by the time we get there, because this has been taken this seriously, we're able to report a great deal of success. That doesn't mean that there isn't still work to do. And let me just give you an example, if I may, about this. A few years back, we went in to do a restoration in a recreational facility for a municipality in Southern Ontario. On the face of it, the conflict in the organization was between two people who had been in conflict with each other for about 15 years. And it was serious conflict, even to the extent that there was an allegation that death threats had been made, and so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. And so this conflict sort of raged its way on, and people taking sides and so on and so forth. And it was between two women who were quite senior in the work group. And so we worked through all of that. We sorted it through, and and it was clear that it affected everyone, and so on and so forth. And then we kind of built a new consensus moving forward. And we came back to monitor 6 months later, and people were saying, yeah, all that's great. These two women are working really well together, and so on and so forth. But now we've got another challenge. And what they realized was that this challenge between these two women was so loud. It was so, the conflict was so overwhelming that it overshadowed all the other problems in the workplace, right? And so once that was sorted out, then there's these other underlying problems that we had the opportunity to work with them on. And one of them was about it was a generational difference. And that generational difference actually involved the two women being on one side together, as well as a few other senior people, and a bunch of junior people who were on another side, had another issue altogether. So,
right. Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, that's it sounds like an incredibly thorough process, and one I'm sure you've tweaked over years and years of trial and error and experience. And I'm happy that it's getting good results. I'm curious about the concept of ripeness within culture and transformation. Is there a period maybe in the assessment phase where you're talking to people and you just realize that this isn't ripe, and is there a window where your efforts aren't going to be very effective, or is that something you can work through as well?
It's a really, I think, a really useful concept. The idea of issues being ripe for resolution and sometimes rotten for resolution. Interestingly enough, in the workplace restoration world, perhaps somewhat differently than the world of workplace health assessment or even maybe interpersonal mediation. By the time an organization is prepared to have someone come in to engage in a full-blown process like this, it's pretty clear that things are ripe for resolution. This can be a fairly expensive process, as you can imagine.
Yeah,
we're talking
right.
about culture change here, right? And the need, the need has to feel very strong for an organization to invest that kind of time and effort and money into it. And it's got to be pretty profound. I mean, with one larger municipal workplace that we work with in Western Canada, there had been 4 or 5 terminations. There was many grievances filed, and there was, a huge reputational impact on the organization for what was going on in these work groups. So I think that's more typical of a restoration process.
Interesting.
I would say one thing, though, that recently I've come across a situation where the conflict might be ripe for resolution, but there are too many distractions in place, and which I think might fit well into the theory about ripeness for resolution. So in other words, there's still too much fighting going on, and people are still too much in fight mode, and so it makes it a distraction and difficult. I mean, we have been able to effect good restoration even when some of the parties are in pretty serious fight mode with each other. But that makes it a lot more difficult than where the parties are recognizing that, hey, we've got to find a different way.
On that topic, do you find you get much, or have you encountered much resentment from the personnel when you guys show up for this work? Do you get any pushback? And if you do, how might you deal with that?
Yeah. So, and this brings us back to how you set that up for success in the organizing phase. So, first it has to do with how we represent ourselves as practitioners to the client and the importance of involving the other workplace stakeholders in this process right at the beginning. Mm-hmm. And so early on, when we were doing restoration work and still finding our way, we had opportunities to make mistakes. And one of them was in a unionized work environment, not being able to convince the employer to more directly involve the union leadership in the process. And that caused no end of problems in terms of credibility and so on. One of the big challenges with workplace restoration is if this is a conflict that can be perceived as employer versus employee, or let's say bad leader, quote unquote bad leader versus staff, and who's retaining the practitioner? It could be the bad leader.
Right.
And sometimes you don't know that until you're in the process. That actually happened to me not that long ago, that under the auspices of we need a restoration here and so on and so forth, it all seemed good, and we're getting involved in the process. Well, it turns out that the person talking to me was at the core of the problem.
Right.
So having said that, my insistence about restoration is that if there's I would qualify the client as being somebody other than people who are directly involved in the conflict. So that might require, in this case, I have to insist that my relationship not be with this person, but be with the chair of the board and so on.
Right. Challenging dynamic.
Yeah, it can be. That's one of the trickiest parts, actually.
Right. And when do you discover that? Probably during the assessment or whatnot. To wrap sort of this process up, you mentioned the beginning, the need is pretty clear to you, or it's pretty clear to the organization that the need is there. Now, what about the end of the process? We talked about the engagement process where you're getting down and doing the work, and also how it could seem overwhelming, but the process itself can sort of gather momentum just through the dialogues and whatnot, and trusting the process, and it just starts taking a life of its own and progressing quite nicely. Now, how do you tell you're ready to move on? Is the end clear?
Yeah, so typically speaking, we like to cap a engagement process off with group facilitation. And that will actually give us a pretty good indication.
Okay.
And, by the way, we typically find that there's an order to these things, to the interventions in the engagement phase. They begin with individual, then go to interpersonal, and then go to group.
Right.
And there's a good reason for that order, because you want to prepare people at each stage for the next stage.
Mm-hmm.
So with regard to coaching, you want to choose the people who most need the help, get them to a place where they can actually productively participate in an interpersonal mediation, for example. And with regard to the difference between interpersonal mediation and the group facilitation, you want that interpersonal mediation to get those people who are in conflict with each other to a point where that conflict is not going to be a distraction for the group facilitation process, right? So you can start to see kind of markers of success along the way.
Interesting.
And if you're not, let's say, having a hard time getting somewhere on the coaching piece, you may go back and say, well, we need more sessions with coaching before we get to interpersonal mediation.
Right. Do you have time? Thank you for that. Do you have time just for a few more questions here? I know we're running sort of long. Just I'm curious if you could just switch to the actual practitioner. It's interesting work and challenging work. Do you feel there's some essential qualities for a practitioner to have or to do this sort of work?
Yeah, Michelle Phaneuf, my Alberta partner, and I have put a lot of thought into this. Actually, we've even thought about the idea of producing a kind of a voluntary guide in that regard. And the reason why we've done that is that we recognize that workplace restoration is so much more than coaching and mediation,
right,
and training and group facilitation.
It's more than the pieces.
It's more than the pieces, and just to give you a bit of a sense of that, change management, understanding of change management principles is critically important. Mm-hmm. Understanding of project management. Right. This is a huge project, and there's a lot of moving parts, and being able to manage those moving parts is critically important. Anybody practicing this in a unionized work environment would have to have a very deep understanding of union management relationships. Mm-hmm. And in my view, some background in union management relationship building, because it's critically important to the success of the process. Coaching, with regard to coaching, conflict management coaching, obviously, but also leadership and executive coaching are skills that are used in this process. With regard to mediation, an understanding and familiarity and comfort with various models and mediation approaches is very important. For example, there are some who would say that, for example, evaluative mediation is not mediation. It is in this context, or at least evaluative mediation is something that is used in this context, and it has to be used in this context, which brings us to the need to understand, have a fairly good grounding in the legal processes and laws that affect this workplace. So there's quite a variety of things that go into this. I mean, having said that, there are people from different backgrounds who have been quite successful at this. They've leaned on the skills that they already have, and they're very open to learning new skills all the time.
I wouldn't mind getting your take on, you're a musician as well.
Mm-hmm.
What are your thoughts about mediation and negotiation as being the art and science? So the extent that you're relying on your intuitive, imprecise, and sort of a creative approach versus the sort of more rigid process, pulling largely from by the book techniques. Is there an optimal synergy there? What's your take on that?
Yeah, I think it's different for every practitioner. For myself, I have worked on the guiding principle that I have to be careful not to be a prisoner of a process.
Right.
That sometimes a process can lead you into a direction that's not helpful for the restoration itself. And this is actually one of the reasons why I insist on calling this workplace restoration as opposed to workplace mediation, because there's so much more involved in this, and applying, for example, the transformative mediation approach, as it was articulated by Folger and Bush, is extremely problematic in workplace setting because there are huge power imbalances in the workplace setting, and you need to be very careful about how you prepare participants to actually participate in a mediation session given those power imbalances.
Right.
So there's what I'd say is my guiding principle has been to extract the wisdom from all the models that I can and not be confined by the models themselves.
Them, yes.
Yeah.
Right. Now, before wrapping up, I'm wondering if you have any general tips for leaders, managers, business owners, and the like. Are there any preventative measures that can be taken to maintain or create healthy, vibrant workplaces so they don't have to bring you in? Or how about for employees? Any tips for them working within a toxic environment? Is there anything they can look to confirm it's unhealthy, or what should they do? Anything at all here?
Yeah, so just starting with employers and managers and the like. And first of all, let me share a story that experience that I had when I was doing a workplace health assessment, which has some similarities to restoration. I was talking to the manager of procurement in an organization, and the manager of procurement was saying, my staff are driven crazy. They don't talk with each other. They're always pointing fingers at each other, and nobody knows what anybody else is doing, and nobody has time to do anything because we're just constantly bombarded here, and the whole place is a mess. Mm-hmm. And I asked the manager, well, tell me about your staff meetings. The manager says, staff meetings? We don't have time for staff meetings. And he went on this, litany again. And, so we had a conversation about this and talked this through. And about half an hour later, he realized that they don't have time not to have staff meetings, that there wasn't any opportunity for people to communicate with each other in a positive and structured way. There wasn't any opportunity for people to understand what each other is doing. And with the lack of staff meetings, there was lots of opportunity to build negative attributions toward each other and resentment. And this is what I say to managers and leaders all the time. If you want to understand what the state of conflict is with your staff in the organization, then talk to them.
Right.
You know, make sure that you are able to create a safe place to have discussions with them. And, you know, and of course, that assumes that you're not the biggest problem here, right, as the manager.
Yeah, right.
But you know, but even having said that, if you fear that you're one of the problems, then think that through and think through why that might be the case, and ask advice from your staff and from your colleagues about, you know, about this, about how you can be a better manager, that sort of thing. You know, in terms of employees, I think it's pretty obvious when there's an organization, when there's conflict. You know, people aren't open with each other, they're not talking. The mood in the room is usually pretty negative. It's you know, I've literally walked into some workplaces and stepping in the door, the temperature went down by about 20 degrees. You know, like, I mean, you can feel it.
The chill in the room you mentioned, yeah.
The chill in the room. But this is primarily the result of unmanaged one-party manifest conflict that arises through negative attributions and no good, safe, supportive opportunity to have dialogue about issues.
Right. So if an employee is in that situation, and what do they do, especially if their managers, or they can't turn to them, the communication channels aren't there? What do you suggest they do?
Yeah, and so, you know, there's depending on the work situation that you're in, and there's such a huge variety of work situations that it's, you know, it's difficult to say what your rights are. Even if you're a unionized employee, let's take, for example, federal government. You could be a unionized employee, but you could be indeterminate. And what that means is that the employer basically has the right not to hire you back after a certain period of time. Well, whatever rights you think you have are going to be trumped by that fact, right? So you're most likely going to be very guarded in your criticisms, so on and so forth. But having said that, like, I'd say from a realist's perspective, the best way to deal with a situation where there is conflict is to work on yourself and manage yourself. And, you know, what I'm not talking about is harassment or discrimination or violence. But in a case of conflict, and, you know, I've had this, the unfortunate opportunity of having to coach, you know, dozens, if not hundreds, of people in the situation where they feel like they're not being valued or treated well. My advice to them has been, you know, to do what it takes to choose to see yourself as a positive contributor and kind of manage your responses and your approach to make the deliberate decision to take a positive approach to things. And that's something that, how do I put this, that works on others as well. You know, as they see you being more positive, it's more likely that they will be too.
The spillover effect, yeah.
Exactly.
That's great. Is there anything you'd like to add at this point, or I've kept you for a while here? Is
No, well, yeah. I mean, I think the one thing that I'd like to underline, especially about restoration, is that the circumstances upon which you're brought into a restoration often seem very bleak. So I don't get called for a restoration because everything is rosy and,
Yeah.
Everybody's happy. But in my experience with this, what I can say is most of the time, at least half of the time, the workplace and the people in the workplace coming out of the restoration process are way better off than they were going in.
Mm-hmm.
Even to the extent with some of these workplaces, for example, that recreational facility that I was talking about, that was regarded within the whole city as the worst place to work in the whole city. And by the time we were through, it was actually regarded as the best facility to work.
Wow.
And so this is a glorious opportunity disguised as a challenge for many workplaces. It's a glorious opportunity to reinvent yourself.
Right.
And that's really the business that we're.
Wonderful. That's what we always speak about, of seeing conflict as an opportunity, right?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being so open about your process. Really insightful. If people want to learn more about your work, where can they find you?
Yeah, they can go to my website, workplacefairness.ca, and and there's lots to dig into at the site.
Right on. Thanks again, Blaine.
All right. Okay. Thank you, Warren.
Thanks for listening. If you want to hear more from international experts digging into a range of topics on conflict, power, and persuasion, subscribe to your favorite podcast app or visit us at ciian.org. That's CIIAN.org.